Welcome to Pax Britannica. Oliver Cromwell and Ireland with Professor Micheál Ó Siochrú. Today I am honoured to welcome Micheál Ó Siochrú, Professor in Modern History at Trinity College Dublin. Professor Ó Siochrú has published extensively on early modern Ireland, and particular mention has to be made of his books Confederate Ireland, 1642 to 1649, and God's Executioner, both of which have been invaluable to this podcast. In addition to these monographs, he has contributed dozens of journal articles and chapters in edited collections, and been a leading figure in the 1641 Depositions Project, the Down Survey of Ireland Project, and a recent effort to publish all known writings and speeches of Oliver Cromwell, and I am very grateful to him for taking time out of his very busy schedule to speak with me. Because of how hectic his schedule currently is, we were strictly limited by time, so I had to prioritise certain questions. I've re-recorded some of them to improve the flow. Professor Ó Siochrú, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, I'm delighted to be here.
To kick things off, what made you want to be a historian, and why did you choose early modern Ireland as your specialty?
I've always had an interest in history. I think my grandfather was a historian and loved to talk about things history. So I think that interest was always there for me. I was quite late entry into the field because I went off and had a different career. So I was quite late coming into academia, but, you know, history was something that I always had an attraction, so I was quite happy to come into it. Where I came in, I think for me, there's been a sort of an obsession with 20th century Irish history, and particular with the struggle for independence in the early decades of the 20th century. And I felt that there wasn't really enough emphasis put on, if you like, the long-term context of what was going on in the 20th century, and really so much of what's happened to Ireland and in modern Ireland, really the genesis of that and the sort of explanation for that can be found much further back. And I think in particular the 16th and 17th centuries are absolutely crucial in that regard. So that was the area I decided to focus on.
Because Confederate Ireland eventually does lose to Cromwell, it feels like the weaknesses of the Confederacy are emphasised. What would you say would be the Confederacy's greatest strength? Because it did quite well for a period of time.
It's an extraordinarily successful organisation to a large degree, given the challenges that it faced. And what we have with the Confederate Ireland in the 1640s is really the first time at a national level where the Irish come together to govern themselves. And of course, it's the last time that happens until the early decades of the 20th century. So it's an extraordinarily interesting time. And as people tend to focus on its collapse and its failures and its internal weaknesses. But that's really from benefit of hindsight. I mean, at the time, what it actually achieves is to bring together, a large disparate group of interest from around the country to set up, if you like, an alternative government with an executive, a legislature, judiciary, instigates taxation, puts together armies that it keeps in the field for the best part of 10 years, and sends diplomats out to the major powers of Europe. So, I mean, it's an extraordinarily successful experiment on many levels. And I think really ultimately that the full power of the English state when directed against the Confederacy is a mismatch. And it simply isn't able to stand up to the manpower, the financial power of the English state, and ultimately fails in that regard. But I think really we should be looking more at what it achieves over the course of the best part of 10 years rather than its ultimate demise.
I asked Professor Ó Siochrú about Archbishop Rinuccini, the papal nuncio who wielded a large amount of influence during his short time in Confederate Ireland, and whether his agenda of a wholly Catholic Ireland had a realistic chance of success.
Rinuccini, the papal nuncio who arrives in Ireland in 1645, is often portrayed in historical accounts as some kind of an extremist, unbending, unwilling to compromise and therefore unrealistic. I think Cini's position was actually quite clear, and what he was arguing is that in a country that was overwhelmingly Catholic, that there needs to be some kind of recognition of that fact and of the status of the Catholic religion within Ireland. Ultimately, that proves politically impossible from an English perspective. But I mean, to criticise him for that, I think kind of spectacularly misses the point. I mean, why would a papal nuncio really hold any other position? And I think that there was widespread support within Catholic Ireland for the views he expounded. But ultimately, political realities meant that it simply wasn't possible. I mean, was it ever going to be possible? Well, I think probably realistically, if they were going to maintain some kind of link with the Stuart monarchy, it was always going to prove a challenge. But I think there were those who did argue that really there was no compatibility between a Catholic Ireland and the Stuart monarchy, and perhaps they should be looking for alternatives, whether that be a sort of a native monarch or whether they would switch their allegiance to Spain. But, all of these things are presented as somehow, sort of pie in the sky and unrealistic, as if the only relationship that has any meaning or that was in any way acceptable was the one with England. But, that doesn't necessarily have to have been the case.
Professor Ó Siochrú has published on the diplomatic efforts between the Confederate Irish and the Duke of Lorraine to request military aid in the last years of the Confederacy. I asked why the Confederates appealed to Lorraine, which seemed to me to be quite a surprising choice.
Irish Catholics' decision to approach the Duke of Lorraine, Charles Duke of Lorraine, to look for military aid, it must be seen in the context of a European-wide conflict in which you have these military figures such as Wallenstein or Lorraine, who effectively are operating as independent commanders with access to large sums of money, able to raise large numbers of troops. And in that context, an approach to Lorraine isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. Lorraine was stateless effectively at this stage, having been driven out of Lorraine, and was something of an adventurer and always looking for opportunities. And certainly Ireland presented one such opportunity. Now, I think by the time they approached him, the military situation in Ireland had reached such a critical stage that he ultimately decided that it wasn't worth his while to get involved. But again, the way this has tended to be written about is that, again, it was some sort of far-fetched scheme that was never likely to come to fruition. That's not necessarily the case at all. And I think had the military situation been somewhat different in Ireland at the time, there may be in every prospect that Lorraine could have intervened. He did send some aid over. He was willing to at least explore the possibility. But ultimately, as Catholic Ireland's military position began to crumble, he decided probably quite correctly from his perspective that really had very little to gain from intervention in Ireland. But, we must look at all of this in the context of what was happening right across Europe in the mid-17th century.
Professor Ó Siochrú recently edited a volume of The Letters, Writings and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell. This is the most complete collection of Cromwell's personal papers ever put into one place. Professor Ó Siochrú is, of course, no stranger to Cromwell, so I was curious if there was anything which surprised him while working on the project.
Well, I think that multi-volume series that we did for Oxford University Press there recently on the letters, papers and speeches of Oliver Cromwell, effectively it turned into, the best part of 15 years of a project, was something we thought initially might take 3 or 4. And I think one of the reasons why it took so long was how extraordinarily difficult it was to try and recapture Cromwell's voice, because there's actually not a huge amount of his original correspondence that survives. And many items that we have are actually copies of copies of copies. And one of the big challenges we faced was trying to find the most authentic copy, or the one closest to the time and to the man, in order to try and give the most authentic version of what it was that Cromwell said. And in doing so, I mean, again, one of the things, it's not necessarily a surprise to me, but just the degree to which, Cromwell, who's often portrayed either as a supervillain or a superhero, or, as a founder of the British Empire, or as a savior of democracy or king killer, Cromwell, the man, comes across very strongly in his letters, be it, in letters to his family, be it in letters to comrades and friends, and the extent to which, historians are forever trying to put, shape and sense and, categories onto the chaos of the past. And oftentimes the past is far messier than perhaps we would like to acknowledge. And Cromwell comes across really as a fascinating man. Obviously a very problematic and controversial historical figure, but really a fascinating one nonetheless, living through extraordinary times and having spent so long, working through his correspondence and his speeches and reports on what he's saying. You really are, it reinforces the extent to which we're dealing with really quite an extraordinary individual.
Well, to follow on from that, like you say, Cromwell is this extraordinary figure. He almost seems to be one of the last great men of history. Do you think Cromwell deserves the attention he's been given, or is he a bit overbearing over the period?
I think there's been a tendency with Oliver Cromwell to see him as effectively far more controlling and directing events than perhaps is actually the case. I mean, he was obviously a hugely important, influential person, both militarily and politically, during the 1640s and 50s. But there were many important and influential people, and Cromwell was one of those. And he was somebody who relied on alliances, on military support, in order to achieve anything. And he simply wasn't operating in a vacuum. So I think there's a tendency, we call it the Cromwellian period or the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, or, we use his name as if he is effectively controlling and directing everything. And that just simply isn't the case. So it's not to try and diminish his significance or importance or his impact, but it's more to acknowledge that he is a character in a fairly broad play here with many different people involved, and I think it's important to interpret him and his actions within that, and not to try and just assume that everything he does is in his interest, for himself, decided on by himself. It's much more complicated than that.
You recently contributed a chapter to the Cambridge World History of Genocide. So to ask a question which you pose in that chapter, was the Cromwellian conquest genocidal?
This is obviously something I've been grappling with for quite some time, because obviously using terminology like that can be, obviously very emotive. And I think instinctively a lot of people would have a problem with using the term genocide in the context of English involvement in Ireland. I think by any criteria, either the criteria of the time or certainly by modern criteria, I think the English conquest across the 16th and 17th centuries, of which the Cromwellian conquest was really the final phase. This had been going on for the best part of a century before Cromwell ever came to Ireland. But I think that conquest of Ireland from the mid-16th century to the mid-17th century is unquestionably genocidal in intent and in impact. The people of Ireland are being targeted as a people. So it's not just simply a case of, armies fighting armies or military engagements. There is a sustained attack on the people of Ireland, on the culture of Ireland, in an attempt to wipe it out. And the fact that ultimately they don't succeed, it does not mean, therefore, that the intent at many times during the 16th and 17th century was actually genocidal. And even looking at what we call the Cromwellian conquest from 1649 to 53, using just purely English sources, by their own reckoning, the population of Ireland falls anything between 20 to 40% during this period of time. I mean, it's absolutely catastrophic. And there's widespread destruction of infrastructure, of land, and people who are not killed are driven from where they live. Many of them are shipped abroad, either to serve in the armies of Catholic Europe, in France and Spain, or many tens of thousands are shipped across the Atlantic to work in sugar plantations. So whatever way we look at this and whatever criteria we apply, it really is difficult to escape any other conclusion that this really is genocidal, and it's absolutely disastrous from the perspective of the Irish.
I asked Professor Ó Siochrú about the hopes of Irish Catholics after the Restoration and whether these hopes were answered.
Well, I think we shouldn't really ever underestimate the significance of what happens in England, Scotland and Ireland across the mid-17th century. I mean, this is 150 years before the French Revolution. It really is an extraordinary time. We have the public trial and execution of the king, the complete overturning of a political system that had operated for centuries. Both in Ireland and Scotland, we've got military conquest. And in an Irish context, resettlement as well, which leads to the expropriation of near on 60% of the landowners of Ireland, the Catholics, who were replaced by a new Protestant landowning class. So it really is, I mean, the extent of the changes that take place here are really absolutely enormous. And, it really is a time of great upheaval and great change. Extraordinarily, when Cromwell dies and the experimental Republican government comes crashing down shortly afterwards in the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, there's a very determined attempt, certainly in England and to an extent in Scotland as well, to simply try and wipe that period from the collective memory as if it never happened, and to turn the clock back to 1640 and then to move on serenely as if this had just been a blip that can simply be ignored. The one place that simply doesn't happen is in Ireland, where the vested interest from those who benefit from the resettlement of Ireland following the conquest prove very entrenchant and determined to hold on to their gains. And so the hopes of Catholic Ireland that somehow the restoration of the Stuart monarchy would also lead to a turning back of the clock in Ireland and a restoration, crucially, of Catholic landowners who owned something around 60% of the land in Ireland pre-war, never materializes. We get obviously some friends of the king who manage to recover their estates. We get some half-hearted effort with the Court of Claims, which is shut down as soon as it becomes clear that certain Catholics are going to start recovering lands. And so most Catholics are left bitterly disappointed. And really the Protestant ascendancy, which emerges from the 1650s, remains effectively intact. And it's this Protestant landowning elite that goes on to dominate Irish political, social and economic affairs for the next 250 years until the great land reforms of the late 19th century. So whereas Ireland, bizarrely, demographically and infrastructurally, recovers very quickly in the restoration period, and the population begins to grow again very quickly. There's a lot of work done to repair infrastructural damage, etc. This ascendancy is the long-lasting legacy of the wars of the 1640s and 50s, and it is a very long-lasting legacy, as I said, goes on for the best of part of 250 years until these great land reforms in the late 19th century. So the impact in Ireland is absolutely enormous and long-lasting.
As my final question, I asked him for his thoughts on current and developing trends in Irish history.
Well, I mean, I think one of the sort of very positive trends in the last 10, 15 years has been the increasing amount of primary source materials that are being made readily available, either through digitization and becoming online, or the putting together, for example, of the volumes that we just did on Cromwell's letters and papers. More and more of these projects are making the 17th century, in the period that I'm interested in, more and more readily accessible, not only to academics, but to students and to interested members of the public. And I think that's a hugely positive thing, because I think for a long time, historians were working with the same relatively limited amount of sources and just arguing and re-arguing over the same points over and over again without really advancing our state of knowledge, or indeed the arguments in any particular way. And I'm very hopeful that this new influx of source materials is going to have quite a significant impact on historiographical debates and allow us to re-engage with some of these issues in new and exciting ways, and hopefully in constructive ways. I mean, there's never going to be agreement on this. I mean, Cromwell, for example, will remain a hugely controversial figure. Whatever we do and however much we work on him, there'll be those who admire his remarkable achievements. There'll be those who will denigrate his awful behaviour, particularly in Ireland. There will never be a meeting of minds, shall we say, on some of these issues. But I hope that the debates become, certainly more wide-ranging and more nuanced than perhaps they were certainly for a number of centuries, when really, as I said, we were working with a fairly limited amount of materials. So on that level, I think we're entering some interesting times in terms of where historical research and investigations are going at the moment. One of the things for me is that I think there needs to be a sort of increased acceptance of the difficult nature of much of what happened. I think people are sort of reluctant at times to engage with some of this, sort of saying, oh, it's kind of inflammatory and you're sort of digging up old wounds or old sores here, and really it's not helpful. And to me, the opposite is true. I think it's only with a greater understanding of what happened and how awful it was at times and the difficult legacies it created that we can actually move on in some ways by getting a better understanding of what caused these long-term issues in, for example, Anglo-Irish relations. So, again, to me, that is a constructive and useful development rather than something negative. And the final area, which I think is kind of interesting, is there's increased emphasis away from the narrow Anglo-Irish prism of many of these things, or this obsession with these islands, and seeing things increasingly in a broad European and indeed global perspective. And I think an example of this is the huge amount of work that's been done on the Atlantic world, particularly in the 17th century, and, an acknowledgement that, England expansion into Ireland is part of a broader colonial expansion that includes North America, the Caribbean, and ultimately into Africa and Asia as well. And it's important to see it in this broader colonial imperial context. And I think the insights we get from that, both domestically and internationally, I think are hugely helpful. And certainly my own work now is moving very much into the field of empire, where I'm sort of beginning a new project now, appropriately entitled Empire, and looking at the extent to which Ireland and the exploitation of Ireland, economically and in many other ways, is the rocket fuel that propels England very much center stage in a global context, and leads to the emergence of this extraordinary empire, which by the middle of the 18th century has become predominant. And as I said, in those early years, in the second half of the 17th century, Ireland plays an absolutely key role in that. And so I think for me, some of the more interesting work historiographically is now taking place in these broader colonial imperial contexts, and to try and reinterpret much of what we know or think we know in these contexts, and the insights that is providing. So there's a lot happening in the field at the moment. And I think we're moving away now from this obsession with, particular events or massacres or things that may have happened across the three kingdoms in the 1640s and 50s, to looking at them in terms of sort of the genesis and the emergence of global empires. And that for me is a very exciting development.
Professor Micheál Ó Siochrú, thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Professor Ó Siochrú for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to read some of his work, then I heartily recommend Confederate Ireland 1642 to 1649, as well as God's Executioner, Oliver Cromwell and the Conquest of Ireland. If you read both, you'll have a pretty substantial understanding of the whole period. You can find them everywhere you find good history books. Thanks again to Professor Ó Siochrú for joining me today, to my entire Patreon House of Lords, and to you for listening.